China has never been against the Western Balkan region joining the EU for a very simple reason, because it would be in the interest of China to have these countries stabilized and inside a bloc that shares the same norms and rules in terms of doing business.
Welcome to the ELIAMEP podcast series. I have the pleasure to host in this podcast Anna Krstinovska, an expert in the relations of the Western Balkans with the EU and China. She is president of ESTIMA, a North Macedonia-based think tank, and research associate in the Southeast Europe program at ELIAMEP. We will talk about the complicated area of the Western Balkans. I have always thought the Western Balkans as a very difficult area. Am I wrong in my perception? Have things changed?
Thank you very much for your invitation. Well, I would not specifically label the Western Balkans a difficult area, but we are certainly not boring countries. And in the past 30 years, all the 6 countries in the region have faced significant challenges. They all had some sort of an armed conflict, even fully fledged wars. They went through difficult transition periods and many shady privatization deals, which left them significantly more impoverished in comparison to other parts of Europe. Even now, they are still maybe at 1/3 in terms of GDP per capita. They have significantly unstable political institutions. They're all labeled to be fragile democracies. They have a huge infrastructure gap, a gap in terms of human development, etc.
Well, my second question is about the European Union. Is the EU really willing to enlarge in the Western Balkans? Because for so many years, the EU does not seem to have a coherent and strategic policy towards the Western Balkans. It seems like they want Western Balkans, but without making an actual commitment.
Well, given everything that has been happening, especially in the past 20 years and since the Thessaloniki summit in 2003, I think that the general perspective about these countries joining the EU is certainly there. However, there is a lack of punctual and concrete timeline when this will happen. So this makes the prospects for all the citizens in the region somehow very gloomy, and there is not much confidence that this process will happen quickly or that we will join the EU anytime soon. And that in turn leads to significant challenges in the countries themselves, who are simply not fulfilling all the necessary reforms to join the EU. And as some officials in Brussels want to put it, the Western Balkans are pretending to be reforming, and Brussels pretends to believe that that is the case. And at the same time, we have a very negative mood in some of the EU member states, and EU member states all need to be on board and say yes for these countries to be able to join the EU. And we see that in many of the countries, the public opinion is simply against enlargement. So this somehow contributes to a vicious circle, and these countries at the same time do not feel the reforms to join the EU, and it is perpetuating. They don't have the motivation to do that, and without fulfilling the reforms, they simply are not attractive countries for the EU to want to integrate.
Did the war in Ukraine complicate matters in the Western Balkans? And I'm asking that because the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Vice President of the European Commission, Josep Borrell, said that the EU enlargement takes on a new geopolitical significance. And I want to ask you, and he also said that it is a long-term investment for the peace, prosperity, and stability of our continent. So how do the Western Balkans fit now that there is a war in Ukraine? Does that make things more complicated, or is Brussels willing to make some sacrifices and have the Western Balkans in the EU now that they regard Russia as the enemy?
Well, the situation is certainly becoming more complicated from a geopolitical point of view, and the process is important because it is a precondition for the overall stability in Europe. Nevertheless, with the war in Ukraine, the number of candidates and potential candidates to join the EU also increased. At the same time, the EU has maintained its position that these countries will not join the EU unless they finish all the necessary reforms. So on one hand, the EU is more aware about the importance to do the enlargement. On the other hand, enlargement is not going to happen anytime soon unless there is some sort of a political decision, just like it was the case back in 2004 and 2007 with the Big Bang enlargement when the Central and Eastern European countries joined. And this cannot be fully excluded because yesterday the leader of the EPP, Manfred Weber, was talking about a new historical enlargement coming to the forefront, but it is an idea which is still not mature and still not acceptable probably for most of the capitals in the EU member states.
I want to talk a little bit also, not a little bit, a lot about China and China's role in the Western Balkans. We have seen for many years that China has increased the investment in the Western Balkans and plays a role there. We have seen now China playing also a role in the Russian-Ukrainian war and with its relations with Russia. How do you see, you are an expert in China relations, and so I want to ask you, how do you see China fitting in the Western Balkans, also regarding Russia, but also its relations with the EU?
Well, let me start with the aspect of the EU integration. China has never been against the Western Balkan region joining the EU for a very simple reason, because it would be in the interest of China to have these countries stabilized and inside a bloc that shares the same norms and rules in terms of doing business. Because first and foremost, China is interested in access to the European single market. So having these countries in the European single market, but also at the table when foreign policy decisions are being adopted, would be beneficial for China. And then China has also been present, as you mentioned, in the area of infrastructure. So in this case, we also have a sort of a synergy with what the EU is doing, because China has been investing and providing funding for projects in the trans-European network. So it is these main corridors, the same corridors basically. However, there are many questionable deals, and basically the Chinese way of doing things and the way that Chinese companies and banks operate in the Western Balkans goes against the political criteria in terms of fight against corruption, rule of law, and good governance, that all of these countries should implement and should abide by these norms and rules if they want to join the EU. And we should not be talking a lot about Chinese investments, because China's presence in all the countries, with the exception of Serbia, comes predominantly in the form of loans, concessional loans, but also other types of market-based loans, which ultimately have to be paid back by the Western Balkans taxpayers. So while this presence, on one hand, has the potential to be beneficial for the countries in terms of their socioeconomic development, on the other hand, the way that these loans and projects are being managed is simply undermining the values that the region should be upholding on its EU path.
Is China relations with Russia complicating things, not only the Western Balkans, but also in the EU? That's my first question. And my second question is, we have seen in the Western Balkans the influence of Russia and sometimes also Turkey. Is that influence not so strong anymore, and China is the leading country in the Balkans?
Well, China has obviously failed to adopt a neutral position in the case of the war in Ukraine, and it has been consistently siding with Russia. And that is a problem for the whole of Europe, I believe, the EU, but also the Western Balkans. However, I don't think that in the Western Balkan countries, this position that China has adopted has been sufficiently discussed through the media and in terms of a public debate. So many people who are not following China directly are simply not aware what China's position on this issue is. And then we have also to mention that the war in Ukraine has contributed to a more pronounced and more significant polarization in the region between the East and the West. So we were seeing the signs of this polarization even before the war, but now we clearly have some countries in the Western Balkans that are NATO allies and that are doing everything that it is in their power to support Ukraine. And then on the other hand, we have countries like Serbia or Bosnia and Herzegovina, and namely Republika Srpska, that failed to adopt sanctions against Russia and that still have significant portions of their citizens that are actually supporting Russia. And these populations exist also in countries such as North Macedonia or Montenegro that are NATO members. And that is why I would not say that we should be ruling out Russia and its presence and influence in the region. Maybe at the moment Russia is more occupied with the war in Ukraine, so that it does not have that much time or capital to invest in interfering in the region. But I think that this is just temporary. And that also applies in the question of Turkey. It is a completely different sort of presence, which temporarily may be a bit reduced after the earthquake. But then Turkey is one of the most important partners for most of the countries in the Western Balkans, because in many of the countries there is a percentage of Turkish citizens. In North Macedonia, for instance, we have 4% of citizens that declare themselves to be ethnic Turks. So there is this kin state policy that Turkey is implementing in most of the countries. Then there is significant support for the Muslim communities living, for instance, in Kosovo, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also in North Macedonia. But going beyond that, given that Turkey is a NATO member, it has also military cooperation and other types of very intensive presence also in the economic area in virtually all the countries in the Western Balkans.
The EU some years ago welcomed China, welcomed also the investment of China in the EU areas, in the countries of the EU. And we have seen that with time changing. Do you think that there will be a stop in this kind of cooperation between the EU countries and China? Do you see that the European Union will follow in the steps of the United States of America?
I think that it is difficult to predict at this point to which extent the EU will follow the US policies in terms of containment vis-a-vis China. But I think that we already started to see a shift in the EU's policies towards China, especially with the famous labeling of a strategic partner, but also competitor and systemic rival. And if you also see many of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, for instance, countries that were very much enthusiastic about the cooperation with China when the platform for cooperation between China and CEE countries was initially established, now seem to be quite reluctant to continue in this direction. And even 3 of them officially left the platform. So I think that throughout Europe, we see a sort of disenchantment when it comes to the cooperation and the partnership with China. And this is quite visible when you consider public opinion polls, because the public opinion on China has been becoming more and more negative in recent years. And just to mention, it is very interesting that we do not see the same tendencies in the region of Southeast Europe and the Balkans, where public perceptions on China, in the best case, remain the same, and in some of the countries have actually improved. So if you see, for instance, according to MDI surveys in 2018 and 2021, the public opinion on China has improved both in North Macedonia, in Montenegro, and in Serbia. And in Serbia, the opinion improved to the point that if you ask Serbian citizens whether they would be in favor of joining the EU if it meant severing the relationship with China, now we have a majority, over 50%, that say that they would prefer China or Russia over the EU. And I think this is a reason for concern.
I think that is true. That is a reason for concern, of course. But we have seen Serbia in the last years changing, and Serbians changing a lot. I don't think, of course, better if it is because they have forgotten about the European Union, something that happened also with the case of Turkey, or if it is because they truly are in favor of China and Russia. They think that they can help Serbia. And that will be my last question. We see Western Balkans as a whole. We talk about Western Balkans, but listening to you explaining what is happening there, of course, Balkans is a geographical area, but I think it's only that. I think that the differences between the countries of the Western Balkans are very big.
I couldn't agree more, and I tend to say that the picture about the Western Balkans and their cooperation with Russia or China should be pretty much nuanced. Most of the time, unfortunately, when we talk about the Western Balkans, we actually read about Serbia's cooperation with China and with Russia, and the situation is not the same in the other countries. For instance, in Serbia, there is around 20% of the FDI that is Chinese investments. In the other countries, this percentage is maybe 1 or 2%. And the main reason, which goes beyond this economic logic, for Serbia to be seeking closer ties with China and Russia, in my opinion, is related to the domestic politics and the Kosovo issue. Because most of the Western countries have recognized Kosovo, and the only way for Serbia to strengthen its position on the Kosovo issue was and still is to court countries like China and Russia, who have important leverage in the UN Security Council. So these close relations between Serbia and China and Russia also can be largely explained by the Kosovo issue. So now, if this issue is somehow resolved, it may mean that in future, China's and Russia's leverage over Serbia may become weaker, and this may in turn contribute to bringing Serbia closer to the EU and to the West.
Well, and my absolutely last question to you, Ms. Krstinovska, is if you would put your own title in this podcast, what would it be?
This is the most difficult question that you have asked me today. Can we say something like the Western Balkans between the East and the West?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This was another ELIAMEP podcast with Odin Linardatou. Recording, editing, and sound editing by Petros Karpathiou. Follow us on the ELIAMEP channels on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and elsewhere.